Welcome back to our panel discussion, How Multi-Cloud Approach Can Help Agencies Meet the Mission, sponsored by Ironbow Technologies, Dell Technologies, Intel Corporation, and VMware here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Brian Merrick, the Director of the Cloud Program Management Office at the State Department. Rocky Campione is the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Energy. Jamie Holcomb is Chief Information Officer at U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Troy Massey, Director of Enterprise Engagements at Ironbow Technologies, and Melvin Greer, the Chief Data Scientist for the Americas at Intel Corporation. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were talking about multi-cloud strategy, and I want to delve in a little bit deeper into that, and maybe we'll start with you, Brian, this time. You have multiple workloads, multiple locations, and multiple clouds, and we need to somehow rationalize all this in our planning processes. And I think agencies, as we mentioned, would like to have portability of their workloads among different clouds so that you get a cloud agnostic or brand agnostic, if you will, approach to the work, gives you greater control. How are you handling all that?
So as you can imagine, I mean, it's a complex environment. And so what we're trying to do is really provide purposefully duplicative options for a couple different reasons. One, we want to make sure that we can meet our bureau customers where they are in terms of the technology stacks they've already adopted and the training and expertise of their existing staffs. In addition, licensing is a major part of the decision on this, and license costs, as some of the other guests have talked about, are a major driver. And so that does have an impact on how we look at where certain workloads live. In addition to that, it also depends where the data is going to go, how it's going to be used. So we have some of our larger customers that routinely share large amounts of data with other agencies, even other governments. And so for them, their strategies usually revolve around using SaaS tools for the facing and the UI components, and then either leaving their data itself on-prem if the existing hardware is sufficient, or moving that data into low-cost storage that can then be accessed by multiple different SaaS fronts. By doing that, we really maintain control over our core data, but also take advantage of the functionality and capabilities of some of the other tool sets out there. So it really does involve multiple factors in that decision, and each customer is different based on their mission needs and what they're trying to achieve. So as we work through these problems with our customers, we try to make sure they understand the options, and a big part of our job is to provide the underlying platforms that they can use to do that. And we try to encourage folks to use SaaS and PaaS and serverless as much as possible to reduce their infrastructure burden and improve their time to market. But they also have to think about the licensing implication of having their data in a highly indexed proprietary system. So when you do need to share that or move that data, there can be hidden costs in that. So it really does depend on the use case. But that's something that has been pretty impactful. And we also try to encourage folks to think about the data analytics side of the use of their data. So especially if they're going to need to use this data for AI purposes, we want to make sure that it's clean, that it's mapped to our master reference data files, and that they've got good automated hard stops worked into their application layer so that you reduce the amount of bad data that comes in the first place that then has to be normalized. And that's been highly successful in some of our COVID application support requirements that we've done in the last recent months. Definitely has kind of moved the needle on how we look at where we move workloads and how we manage the data around those workloads and make good choices about using the right platforms.
And just a clarification question about when you mention your customers, you mean the different mission areas within the State Department?
Correct. Right, the different mission areas in the State Department are internal folks that we support.
Okay, and Jamie, tell us about your multi-cloud approach and how you control not just the flow, but the costs relative to all of this data movement when you've got, again, far-flung operations pretty much. And you've also got officers, examiners, patent examiners, who are all working all over the place. There's no one central location for them either.
Yes, we are lucky in effect that we do only have one current central location where all of our examiners actually VPN into, and that is Alexandria. So as far as the cloud, it serves as promise, but we're not there yet. So I have the ability to learn from all the great lessons that everyone else is teaching me on how best to move to the cloud smartly. And one of the biggest tenets of our architecture will be preventing lock-in. Now, of course, the providers have the obligation to differentiate on their core business values, and you don't want to make it a commodity or a utility. So they're going to try to get you as sticky as possible. What you have to do is discern what is a utility versus what is the managed service. And if you can do that effectively, then you can figure out how to transfer between different clouds. Right now, the three clouds that we're considering as primary, although there's many other cloud providers, they've been mentioned before: AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. I mean, those seem to be the top three that are the largest, and each has its own unique characteristics or services that they provide in a differentiated fashion. The key, I believe, is not to go down the sticky path on any one of them so that you can hold them each accountable. And it's just good business. For every McDonald's, there needs to be a Burger King. For every Hertz, there needs to be an Avis. Oh, wait a minute. We're in COVID. I forgot. I apologize.
All right, no sign for that one though, right?
No.
Okay. Well, so Rocky, is it just simply a matter then of getting the best SLA you can with a given cloud and you're stuck there, or is there portability and interoperability available to you?
I think it depends. I think sticky is not always bad. Sometimes you're willing to accept it because it's just the service is the service, but it is something you have to be aware of. I talk a lot. I've been at the department about a year now, and I talk a lot about how do we set the table for innovation. And this relates to cloud, and most of the major vendors are doing the innovation in the cloud first, and then you might get it on premises. New services that get added in are being added into the cloud versus something you put on premises typically. So what we've been doing over the last year, and it'll lead into the next year, is setting that table for innovation, which means setting up cloud environments with authorities to operate for Microsoft, Google, AWS. Those are kind of the first big three. We're looking at some of the others. Oracle has a cloud. I think it's FedRAMP now. We'd kind of look at that. So you take what's been FedRAMPed, then we add on what is our departmental requirements, and we create the cloud environments that are ATO'd. Now, I think we have the same issue Brian has. I can't create an agency-wide ATO that Los Alamos National Lab would love, that Berkeley National Lab would love. They have different risk environments. They have different missions. One deals with nuclear weapons, one's dealing with open science. But by creating kind of standard cloud moderate and in some places cloud high, FedRAMP or ATO'd environments, we allow for the mission to say, which one do I want to choose? But we've also looked at different clouds and said, hey, look, we want to standardize as much as possible for this mission on this cloud because it allows us to federate better. We talk about email and collaboration. We're going to be 95% in one cloud, and it just allows us to federate our Active Directories or federate our environments better to allow for better communications amongst our national labs, amongst our headquarters and program offices. But in other areas, we might look at a specific cloud and say, they're really strong in one area around innovation. So like talk about scientific computing as a service and what we want to do with that. And then we work our deals with those. It's not just an SLA, it's actually the procurement process. We just awarded a procurement today for Google Cloud Platform that kind of covers the entire department. But what was unique about it is we work with our national labs that do a lot of scientific computing to what matters to you. And we built that into the contract on the front end. So egress is massively discounted because they share around the world. So we might get data in from the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, It might come into our national labs. We might do research with it. We might share data with somebody else. So egress was actually in some ways more important for us from a pricing perspective than maybe some of the other areas. So we focused on that as an area to get discounts on. Another area that we would look at is when you do these large scientific projects that might utilize AI, might, you're studying kind of massive problems, you may not know how expensive your computer, how much compute you really are going to need. And if you're buying by the drink, it could eat up your entire budget. So we also built into the contract, we call them kind of enterprise deals, that for specific projects, we can bound it and say, hey, it's going to cost $100 no matter what. And if we only use 90, shame on us. And if we use 120, we save the taxpayer a lot of money. But for these large scientific projects, we allow for kind of price stability, the ability to budget, the ability not to have your compute take up all of your money because it was successful. So we look at just one, setting the table for innovation, so having multiple clouds that are ATO'd, so our mission can make decisions and move between each one as needed. And then more importantly, what we're looking at now is how do we set up procurements and contract vehicles that focus on how we're going to use that cloud, so that it can help the mission and help us kind of focus on the areas that make sense versus the areas that I don't care if I get 100% discount on something I'm never going to use. I'd rather pay full price for that and get a discount on something that matters and can eat up our budgets.
Okay, so Troy, I want to ask you, we've heard a lot of what I would call, just to distill it down, complexity because of the competition among missions. I say technical competition, not the human competition, and also the need for locations, the need for data all over the place. And I want to back upstream a minute to the application and some of the implications for making sure applications are ready for the cloud. And talk more about the refactoring process. Can that be done in such a way as to result in a almost portable container that has your application, such that when you do refactor for the cloud, you only have to do it once, and then you can meet all of these possible needs?
Absolutely. Great question. So let's talk about two different types of applications. One is your standard application out there. Let's say it's a SQL Server or Oracle Server or whatnot, and the ability to bring it to the cloud. Back in early cloud adoption, that application needed to be packaged to go to a public cloud. Along with other downfalls of egress and unknowing about how much storage space you need and all that other stuff out there, there was, if you didn't like that cloud provider, you had to pay to get it unpackaged. So there was that hidden cost of, if you're not happy, you're going to pay to get happy again. So there's avoiding that repackaging, keeping an application in its native state. You can bring it from one cloud to another or back on-prem if needed, if desired. So that's part of the goal. The other part that's a lot trickier is legacy applications. So we all have environments like this where we've built entire networks around this system that was some homegrown application that can't live off of a modern OS, can't live off of modern hardware. So we sit and we leave this environment untouched, and we pray that it never goes down, because the hardware that it's built on was built like 10 years ago and they don't make it anymore. So we just cross our fingers that's never going to go down. So the idea is to be able to refactor that application, to decouple it from the hardware and be able to move it into a cloud-ready state. Now, I think it was Jamie mentioned earlier, sometimes that can be very, very expensive. So there's that cost analysis. Do you recode something or do you refactor it? And that has to be part of the process. But the end goal needs to be that is a portable application.
Okay, and then let's back up one more step, Melvin, and that is to the data layer here. And we've also heard about the need for data in multiple locations. And then there's also the phenomenon that in the drive to have more evidence-based decision-making in the federal government, and that it's actually the law of the land, whether agencies are there or not, but it is statutory and regulatory requirement, and so on. Often analysis requires multiple applications to access multiple databases. And so how does that all get translated into some cogent way, cost-wise and technically, in multiple cloud and hybrid environments?
It's really interesting because we've been talking about moving to the cloud as if it's a single entity that we're moving to. But thoughtful managers like the ones here in agencies recognize we have 4 deployment models. We have 3 service models in cloud. And so these nuances, they really are what are the criteria that helps us understand what kind of capabilities we actually want to operationalize in the cloud. The cloud architects that work at agencies are really answering 3 basic questions. The first one is, what mission capability do I need to operationalize? Is this an internal mission capability that doesn't require external interfaces or external stakeholders? Is it the nature of the mission such that I'm not doing highly sensitive and highly confidential capabilities, and that I can expose this function to a public audience? This might lend itself to a hybrid multi-cloud that includes public cloud capabilities. But if we have more sensitive mission capability, if it's extended, like was mentioned with Brian, around the globe, and if it requires the kind of real-time response and actionable intelligence that sometimes is required in state and energy and USPTO, then we might require a different deployment model and a different service model. So these are all nuances that help drive the decision making and require us to be more thoughtful. The second question is really the one that hits on what you asked, which is, what type of data am I actually going to be putting in the cloud? Am I going to be putting data that's highly volatile? Am I going to be using data that is more public as opposed to private? Am I doing recruiting and training on data and as opposed to a core mission capability around emerging science? Am I engaging data that is coming primarily from universities on advanced research in mechanical science or in chemical science or in neuroscience? Or am I pushing data out to the agency members that have to do their core functions? Data has characteristics, and each workload can have a fundamentally different way of operating in the cloud. And so what type of data is the second question. And then third is, who do I really need to engage? And in some ways, what we're finding is that many agencies are doing a one-way push with their data. Some agencies are doing a pull only from the cloud for their data. And some agencies are doing it two-way, this conversation and dialogue with their data. And so depending on who they need to engage, how they need to engage going forward, it will have a fundamental impact on what cloud deployment model and what service model that the agency chooses. So these agency leaders are very thoughtful when it comes to how they're going to pick hybrid multi-cloud options, how they're going to extend the security model from the enterprise into those options, and how they're going to be able to interact with and engage their stakeholders, and what type of data is really going to be required to do so.
Well, Mr. Greer, you've given us about 6 more variables here to add into this, this calculation for cloud movement. And so on that note, we'll take a short break. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This panel discussion is how a multi-cloud approach can help agencies meet the mission, sponsored by Iron Bow Technologies, Dell Technologies, Intel Corporation, and VMware here on Federal News Network. We'll be right back.